That's awesome. All right, say hi to Hailee. And hi Hailee, there you go. Okay, so I said I would backtrack a little bit. Again, you're looking for how federal power expanded via governmental action, and more specifically through the power of judicial review to look at certain key phrases within the Constitution and give the federal government more expanded power. When we looked at Gibbons versus Ogden, again, what we defined as interstate commerce was almost any commercial activity, anything that had commercial value that impacted one or more states. And that became one of the most expansive powers of the federal government. Again, we used it, you can use it to regulate any industry, even if it is locally based, that, like an insurance or communications industry that, kind of obviously has a multi-state impact. Even if the economic dollars are kind of staying local, if what they're doing involves, some sort of interstate exchange, that's interstate commerce. You can use it to regulate education. You can use it to go into schools and then even private businesses and begin to regulate for anti-discrimination, to use it as a way to enforce anti-discrimination statutes. Basically what we had said was there's almost no limit to the Commerce Clause and the power it gives the federal government, except we finally do hit a limit with a more conservative court with U.S. versus Lopez, and that's kind of where we left off. This, again, was a case involving using the Commerce Clause to regulate schools in this case, but in the sense of being able to declare a gun-free zone. And again, what that means is if you bring a gun into a gun-free zone or drugs into a drug-free zone, you face higher penalties. So it's trying to use the Commerce Clause to create extra penalties or incentives, to curb that kind of practice. What we find here is that they basically say, okay, we've hit the limits of the Commerce Clause. That for this particular court, this is too broad of a definition of commerce. It's too much of a stretch to show that it disrupts the local educational environment, which disrupts students' education and people's willingness to kind of move into that community, which in turn has a statewide impact, which in turn has a multi-state impact. I will tell you, different courts might have looked at it and said it was fine. Often we look at courts and we expect a kind of, law is law is law, justice is justice, but, how they see the law is often unique to the justices, and it's maddening for students at first. It shouldn't be variable, but it is. It depends on the court. What we look at next with you, a second kind of almost companion case that finds limits to the Commerce Clause as well. It's called Prince versus U.S., and I'm actually going to speed past it kind of quickly just to I think it's almost more helpful to start with the visual. Prince versus U.S. revolves around the Brady Act, and the Brady Act was a gun control measure in '97, I believe, that follows the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan and the grave wounding of his press secretary, whose name is Brady, hence the name for the act. And Brady became kind of the champion. He became kind of the figure here that people rallied. This is John Hinckley, and John Hinckley had delusions of grandeur. He felt that if he did something big, he would impress the actress Jodie Foster. I don't know if you know who she is. She's great actress and was a child actress at this point. Not child actress, teen actress, had been in the movie Taxi Driver. And he became obsessed with her, and he felt like if I do something grand, I'll impress her. And so there's the attempted assassination of Reagan, and it was dramatic. I remember, being roughly your age and watching this, on the news, seeing it kind of unfold. And both Reagan and Brady survived, but Brady was, shot in the head. He was paralyzed. He was not the same. What they come up with is the Brady Act. Again, this became the catalyst for gun control. And the Brady Act, basically one of the major components, you're going to read about it a little bit more, a kind of independent activity where you guys look at certain acts and try to figure out how the federal government can use those to restrict the states. But the part that I'll tell you about is it required background checks, okay? So before you can get a gun, you have to go through a federal background check to make sure that you're not mentally ill or a criminal record, or there are other concerns that would keep us from allowing you to have a gun. The issue that the court is going to look at is who should be doing those background checks, because who essentially was delegated to were what they call CLEOs. They're chief law enforcement officials, but they're local chief law enforcement officials. And again, this is where the court finds the limit. It's striking that in each case it seems to involve guns, and I don't know if that was, I'm not suggesting it's an ulterior motive. It just seems to be in that battle between too much federal power in states. It's almost a shame this has to be the issue. So what they say is, and this is when we have a somewhat conservatively dominated court, Scalia is writing the opinion. And one of the things that he says is, and it's a really interesting argument. I've tried to pose it to you a couple of times. Think about who you see the Constitution as a compact between. Is it between the federal government and the states? Is it between the federal government and the people? Is it between the federal government and the people with the states acting as their agent? Depending on how you define it, will help you understand how much power I want for the federal government. If it's between the federal government and the states, and the people, then, largely the federal government is acting within their interests and the states ought to get out of the way. If it's between the federal government and the states, then we have, both parties are part of that compact and need to be respected. What he's arguing is that when you wrote the Constitution, it's kind of an interesting different spin. That the Constitution gave the federal government the power to regulate individuals. He's not talking about who's agent. He's saying that the federal government gave the Constitution gave the federal government the power to regulate individuals, not the states. So that's one of his arguments. More so, he also introduces this unitary executive theory. We talked about that in the past. That's what Bush used during, bless you, a lot of his signing statements, where he was saying, I sit atop the executive branch. The executive branch made up of 3 million different executive branch workers, and I alone direct them. And if you supersede my authority with a law and try to direct my departments or agencies, that violates the unitary executive theory. Well, this is in part where it comes from. And what Scalia was saying is, it's interesting. When Bush argues it, what he's arguing is others can't come in and supersede my authority. What Scalia is arguing is the president can't transfer that authority either. That you can't take your responsibility to run the executive branch and hand it off to local law enforcement officials. That's a violation of the division of powers. Stevens is writing the minority opinion, Justice Stevens. And what he points out, and it is an interesting kind of sign, today's dissent, today's minority opinion could well be tomorrow's majority opinion. In the debates, they talked about not just one appointment. There's Ruth Bader Ginsburg is older. There's a number of older Supreme Court justices. It's within the realm of possibility that the next president gets not one, not two, but maybe 3. There have been presidents like Reagan and Nixon that got 4, and that's not outside the scope of things. Whoever's next is a 2-termer. So, at any rate, today's minority opinion could be tomorrow's majority opinion, and you do see a potential of a shift here when Stevens suggests that if you took the Commerce Clause and you coupled it with the necessary and proper clause, you could say, yeah, we do have the authority to order background checks. Yes, we do have the authority to create gun-free zones. Again, I think it just depends more on the court than it does the law, because the law isn't always that clear. He points out, this is where I get the argument sometimes, that doesn't it stand to reason that we could order mass inoculations, or we could direct states to take action if there's a terrorist threat, if there is a great enough concern, that kicks in maybe the necessary and proper clause, which we can couple with whatever, and assume that power. The court did reject that, but that is kind of in the background. The other thing that, and I'll come to it, my best joke is coming here soon, is we're going to begin to look at a little bit of state backlash too, because when you say to the states, you have to do these local background checks. Well, that's man hours, that's paperwork, that's training, that's money. And where is the money for this? You passed the Brady Act, and you've required background checks, and you've required them done by states, but where's the funding for that? Essentially what you've done is you've taken you've given us the mandate, the requirement to do this, but not the money for it. Therefore, it is an unfunded mandate. I got a great image. It's coming. All right. So from here, we're going to go to, and again, I'm fuzzy from staying up so late for the debates, but we're going to go to one of the more complex sections. We're going to look at a series of New Deal cases and how they interpret this general welfare clause. Fortunately for both you and me, there's kind of a trap door in it. There's a series of cases that are a little esoteric, and it's nuanced as to why they're not okay here and they are okay here. But in general, what we're going to see is that the federal government is going to use its power to lay and collect taxes, and it can use it kind of creatively to use the power of spending money and withholding money to get the states to do what they want, provided it's inducing the states. It's providing, like I said, incentives. If it crosses the line into something coercive, you get what that word means, right? I got your arm and I've twisted it behind your back and you've got no choice. If I go to the point where it's coercive, you've gone too far with this power. But if I'm simply kind of inducing, if I'm giving you incentives via that carrot and stick analogy that we've talked about before, it's okay. Really fine line, though, between inducing and coercive. It starts with U.S. versus Butler. And, certain cases are easier to remember. These, they kind of, blur for me a little bit. So just hold on to that rule of thumb. In this case, what we essentially do is we establish the use of the power to tax and spend has gone too far. But this is where we get the idea of the court essentially almost gives them the roadmap. If you had done it this way, it would have been inducing and not coercive and therefore appropriate. What it centers around is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. What we literally do, we're so good at growing food that we make it unprofitable. The supply far exceeds the demand and therefore it's not profitable. So remarkably, what do we pay farmers to do? What do we, Kai? We basically pay them to not grow, to grow less crops, to bury crops if need be. And what was attached to this Agricultural Adjustment Act were essentially contracts that penalized if you didn't do this. If you're not taking part in the reduction, that kind of quota that they set up, you could be penalized. And the court essentially said that this goes too far. However, again, they hinted that it's not an inappropriate use of power if you use it for the general welfare, if you use it in a manner that is not coercive. Hence, in the next case, they get the formula a little bit better. But I will be honest with you, when I look at this, I still see to a degree coercive. I just think the court interpreted it a little differently. So what you have here is the Social Security Act. And if states aren't participating in this program, they get a higher tax structure. The farmers that didn't, go along with the quota, they faced a penalty through their contracts. Essentially, this is a penalty, but for whatever reason, it passes the litmus test. And, Congress says this is okay because it induces, it doesn't coerce. And so what we see is, using the power to tax and spend begin to go beyond, with farming, at least the major difference was that was a commercial activity. Here, we're more regulating state compliance with programs. We've expanded beyond just commercial economic activity. We're beginning to regulate state actions, but we're just encouraging them, right? Halvering versus Davis is a case that happens on the same day. We're looking at employers this time. When you work, you get a payroll tax deduction that helps fund Social Security, and your employer essentially has to pay a matching portion of that. And again, we're looking at, does this go too far? That, if you remember my list of reserved powers, one of the things that states were responsible for was general welfare. So does this go too far and kind of go into the territory of states' reserve powers? And is this a valid use of the power to tax and spend to induce, or is it coercive? What they say is it's appropriate. It induces. What they look at is the nature of unemployment, and they look at it as a general ill. This is not unique to a particular state. This is something that is, a national problem in scope, especially because we're in the time frame of the Great Depression. And I think it's interesting they kind of talk about, this is a crisis, and it's no different than, to say a person has been thrust out of work and needs unemployment insurance. Old age is something that thrusts people out of work. And again, it's kind of, national in scope in this case. So again, those are three cases that have kind of technical natures to it that make it a little trickier. What I just, here's my summary statement again, because I try to model for like how you'd, try to talk about the evidence that we looked at, the case and the clause combined together, expanding federal power. How do I sum that up? What we look at is this idea of, again, expansive. I've got an expansive definition of this power to tax and spend. It gives us nearly limitless power to regulate, via these conditional appropriations. We'll talk about them as the carrot and stick in a moment. And the only rule is it can't be coercive. What we see them doing, therefore, from here on out is just that, providing incentives. And the examples, if you remember, that I gave you was how we don't have a federal law regarding speed limit, but in the 70s we got a national standard by attaching, bless you, highway funds. We don't have a national law with regard to drinking age, but what we get is a national standard by, again, attaching highway funds. Comply with our, whatever we want to call it, goal, target, recommendation, and we'll give you the extra highway funds. Don't comply and we'll hold it back. Again, kind of in simple terms, it's called the carrot and stick analogy. I get the mule to walk by giving them an incentive that I hold in front of them. For the poor mule, for the poor brute, or for Chris Griffin, you never get it. Yes, that was quick. I worked too hard on that. That was a little longer, right? So again, I think where the analogy fails is they never get the incentive here. It's always held out, beyond them. And I think also I like to often take the stick and think of it as it's not just incentive, it's punishment. If you don't get it, you get hit. If you don't do the thing, you get hit in the form of not getting the money. Right? All right, here comes my best joke. Again, if I am saying do these things and I'm not giving the money, it's this guy showing up to take you to the prom. It's an unfunded mandate. I searched for hours just finding the right kind of, at one point I had Mr. Krabs, but I'm like, he's not really, he's got money. He's just not spending it. I had Scrooge for a little bit. I'm like, no, that's the wrong. He's just thrifty. I want this guy. I spent a long time looking for him. So there he is. He's showing up. He wants to take you out, but he can't even afford to go Dutch. He can't afford to even pay for his half. Can't tuck in his shirt, right? So this again is one of those moments where it will start to help you define yourself politically. Either you look at it as, hey, the federal government is in large, can be a safety net. They can say that, let's say it's an equity issue. Let's say it's making sure that the states comply with some sort of civil rights issue. Let's say it's an educational equity issue. I want to make sure that all schools are educating equally. Let's say it's an environmental concern. I want to make sure that everybody's holding up certain universal standards with regards to the environment. And so I impose a kind of a rule on the states. And I'm going to leave it for the states to fund. For some, maybe the rule is more important than the funding. But for someone maybe more conservative, they might say, hey, the states can handle these issues on their own. And what you're doing is you're passing on a tremendous cost to us without having, without funding it. So instead of this guy, this is really what, this unfunded mandate looks like. Where they keep handing them, in this case, it's kind of funny. It's the states complain about it with the federal government, but this political cartoon points out that states do it to localities. In either case, I'm passing all of these responsibilities. It's more balls up in the air. To kind of NCLB is No Child Left Behind. This is essentially the federal version of MCAS, where there's a requirement for states to have a standardized test, and what they do is then look at the results, and they look at the results demographically. You have to make adequately yearly progress. So it's not enough that you've got, 97% in the high passing rate. They're going to look at what are your low income students doing? What are the minority students doing? Are you continuing to progress them? In some levels, it's even harder maybe for a high performing school because you're having to make this adequately yearly progress. And if you're in the 97th percentile, where do you go, right? If you're a small school like Georgetown too, 4 students can be 10%. And so that all of a sudden is tricky. All of this mandatory testing requires, again, training, requires construction of the tests and administering of the tests and grading of the tests and evaluating the tests. It's costly. And so what you look at is some figures associated with what kind of cost was passed on to the states. Again, I told you today is one of the trickier days. What we're going to look at is, the kind of the flip side to it, I suppose, that there is often instances where the federal government arguably is not providing the funds for states to do things, but often it is. One of the, I might offer you incentives to do something, and the form in which I pay you is called a grant and aid. This is a big umbrella term. So the form in which money goes to the states to induce them to adopt federal kind of programs and federal mandates, it's called grants and aid. And to give you a dollar figure and then make it a little more relative, what we're talking is more than $500 million goes to the states to get them to follow federal kind of programs. And we'll get into it more in a little bit. What that essentially represents is close to 17% of the total expenditures that the federal government does in a given year. There's about a $3.9 trillion budget. And so this is about 17% of that number. It represents about 4% of our GDP. That's the sum total of all the goods and services produced in a country in a given year. That's basically a measure of our total wealth. And that totals around 18 trillion. What it makes up of, even though it's like 17% of the federal government's expenditures, it represents about 25% of state budgets. So states are kind of dependent on this money for about a quarter of their budget. It's a pretty significant figure. Most of this spending is mandatory. There's mandatory spending and then there's discretionary spending. And this breakdown in terms of grants and aid is consistent with the breakdown of how we spend money in general. That most of our money is being spent based on the entitlement programs, the word entitled. I get this. I'm entitled to this. You owe me this. The entitlement programs. Can anybody give me a quick example of something that's a program where people are guaranteed to get something? It is their right. Social Security is the biggest classic example. Medicaid, Medicare, our healthcare costs are a number one driver of our economy or our spending. 30% is discretionary. Give me a category for discretionary spending where we can kind of decide how much to spend. Defense. Some of it is mandatory. If you have a contract, if you're paying soldiers, if veterans benefits. Some of it is discretionary because we can decide whether or not to contract, whether or not to expand the size of the Army, what engagements we what operations we decide to do, and therefore what related costs we decide to take on. So a lot of swirling numbers here, but this gives you kind of a sense of, again, what we're spending on. Medicaid is the largest single driver. It is one of the biggest looming issues that we face. Again, we talked yesterday about the difference between that Medicaid and Medicare. They're both kind of looming issues, but Medicaid is one of the larger concerns because of how much states are required to help fund it. It essentially is, again, what is Medicaid? I talked about it yesterday. It is a joint program. It's essentially something the federal government does in partnership with the states, and what it does is give health insurance to low-income people. We're talking 97 million individuals get health insurance through this, 33 million children. It costs the federal government about 50% of the grants and aid money. That about over $300 billion of the $667 billion is spent on Medicaid, and that does not include what states have to put in. States match. Typically, technically it is a 50-50 formula. For every dollar the federal government spends, states are supposed to match, but they actually have kind of a sliding scale. If you are a more impoverished state, you have to match less. If you're a more wealthy state, it's kind of like our tax code, you pay more, unless you find a tax loophole. So what you see here is, in some cases, states are only paying like 27% of the costs, but it's still one of the most major drivers of their spending. And that, in part, was some of what they were trying to get to in the debate. What they were more talking about in the debate last night is how premiums are, what happened is you had Obamacare, which was trying to fill to get, Medicare covers some people, Medicaid covers other people, but then there's this whole population that is not covered. And the hope was, if you get them insured, if they buy into this system, it will increase the pool and it will drive down everyone's premiums. Well, not enough enrolled, and what you are seeing is the potential of costs going up. The figure cited last night was around 80%. That is the high unique to a handful of states. In other places, the premiums are going up by 2-3%. The average, I believe, is around 8%, but you can fact check that. So do that work, right? At any rate, what the Obamacare is trying to do is to supplement Medicare, because that's not a particularly solvent program either. What we'll get into tomorrow is, I've just given you the generic term grants and aid. It's great. There are two types of grants and aid. They're called categorical and block grants, and then there's two types of categorical, program and formula. And each of them is kind of administered and unique in a different way. Knowing the terminology is kind of important. That's your basic language that you need. All right. Say goodbye to Hailee.
Well,
The